I am Hamish Macbeth, and welcome to the Crimson Noir.
The frost lay thick and white across the heather, glittering like a dusting of crushed diamonds under a painfully bright, cloudless sky. It was a perfect, crisp Highland morning, entirely unsuited for anything as strenuous as police work. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth sat on a cold, flat rock halfway up a crag overlooking the village of Lochdubh, a steaming thermos cup of strong tea, warming his large, red hands. Beside him, his mongrel dog, Lugs, sat at attention, ears twitching at the distant, hopeful scuffle of a rabbit in the underbrush. Hamish took a slow sip, his hazel eyes half closed in deep contentment. Down in the valley, a silver smoke rose from the chimney of the police station. Hamish had banked the stove before slipping out the back door to check a few carefully placed snares. He had managed to secure a plump rabbit for his dinner, a necessary supplement to a policeman's meagre wages, and felt he had accomplished quite enough for one day. His radio, clipped to his heavy jacket, emitted a sharp, static, laced squawk. Headquarters in Strathbane were calling. Hamish didn't twitch a muscle. The dispatchers in the bleak, concrete town of Strathbane had a terrible habit of finding lost tourists or escaped sheep for him to chase, and Hamish firmly believed that ignoring a problem was often the most efficient way to solve it. If it was truly important, they would ring the landline at the station, which he was currently, and happily, not occupying. "Come along, Lugs," Hamish murmured, uncoiling his lanky frame. "Time we were getting back for a proper cup of coffee. The tea's gone a bit stewed." He meandered down the hillside at a pace that suggested he had all the time in the world, his fiery red hair catching the brilliant morning sun. By the time he ambled onto the waterfront of Lochdubh, the village was awake, though moving with its usual glacial Highland speed. That is, until he neared Patel's General Store. A loud, braying voice, unmistakably English, and vibrating with unearned authority, cut through the frosty air. "I explicitly asked if you stocked the artisan sourdough, and you pointed me toward this spongy, preservative-filled brick. Do you not understand plain English in this godforsaken outpost?" Hamish sighed, mourning the loss of a peaceful morning. He pushed open the door of the shop, the little bell chiming cheerfully above his head. Standing at the counter, red-faced and swelling with indignation, was Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton had arrived in Lochdubh 3 days prior, not with the typical fanfare of a wealthy man in a flashy vehicle, but by demanding the local bus driver halt the rattling transit precisely at the end of a muddy lane, delaying the entire route while he barked orders about his matching leather suitcases. He had recently purchased a modest croft just outside the village, intending to transform it into what he loudly called a rustic, authentic retreat for the weary executive. Unfortunately for Pendleton, his idea of authentic involved demanding urban luxuries from people who had neither the time nor the inclination to humor him. He was a stout man, currently dressed in brand new, agonizingly stiff tweed that smelled strongly of a London department store, and he was glaring at Mr. Patel. "It is bread, Mr. Pendleton," Mr. Patel said mildly, his hands resting calmly on the counter. "It makes very good toast. I don't want toast. I want proper bread. Is there nobody in this village with an ounce of commercial enterprise?" Pendleton whirled around as Hamish approached, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the unkempt policeman. Hamish had a bit of heather stuck to his uniform sweater, and he slouched in a way that made him look particularly dim-witted. "Ah," Pendleton sneered. "The local constabulary? Excellent. Officer, perhaps you can explain to these people the concept of false advertising." Hamish scratched his head slowly, letting his jaw drop a fraction to enhance his look of vacant rural stupidity. "Aye? Well, if it says bread on the wrapper and there is bread inside, it's not exactly a matter for the police, sir, unless it's stolen bread." "Oh, course." Pendleton let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Good Lord, they really do scrape the bottom of the barrel out here, don't they? I suppose expecting basic competence from a village bobby is as futile as expecting a decent bakery." "Aye, we're awfully slow," Hamish agreed mildly, his hazel eyes unblinking and utterly serene. "But the bread's not so bad if you dip it in soup. Keep the cold out." Pendleton threw his hands up in despair. Barbarians, a lot of you. He tossed a crumpled £5 note onto the counter. Keep the change. Use it to buy a dictionary. He stormed out of the shop, the bell clattering aggressively in his wake. Mr. Patel watched him go, smoothing the wrinkled note. That man, Patel observed quietly, has a very high blood pressure. He's got a high opinion of himself, that's for sure, Hamish said, leaning heavily against the counter and eyeing a tin of shortbread. He's been making friends, has he? Oh, yes. Yesterday he told Mrs. Wellington her dogs were a public nuisance. And last night he threatened to sue the hotel because the wind was too loud against his window. Patel shook his head. He is an angry man, Hamish. Hamish nodded, slowly, his mind turning over the information. Outsiders like Arthur Pendleton rarely understood the delicate social fabric of a place like Lochdubh. They thought the Highlanders were quaint, slow, and easily bullied. But underneath the polite nods and the quiet subservience lay a fierce pride and a very long memory for insults. Well, Hamish said, straightening up and fishing a few coins from his pocket for the shortbread, let's hope he learns to keep his voice down. Or someone might just decide to teach him some Highland manners. He wandered back out into the bright, freezing sunshine, munching on a biscuit. He fully intended to spend the rest of the morning sitting by his stove, drinking coffee, and doing absolutely nothing. But as he watched Pendleton's stiff-backed figure marching down the waterfront, alienating everyone he passed, Hamish felt a faint, troubling prickle at the back of his neck. It was the instinct of a man who knew his territory. Peace in Lochdubh was a fragile thing, and Arthur Pendleton was practically begging to break it. By mid-morning, Hamish Macbeth had achieved his primary objective for the day: total, uninterrupted inertia. The police station was blissfully quiet, smelling strongly of wood smoke and the rich coffee bubbling away on the cast-iron stove. He sat slouched in his battered leather armchair, his long legs stretched out toward the heat, a local paper resting unread on his lap. Beside him, Lugs let out a soft, dreaming whimper, his tail giving a phantom thump against the floorboards. It was perfect. The frost outside held the village of Lochdubh in a silent grip. The sudden, frantic clattering of the station's front door, being thrown open against the wall, shattered the peace, like a brick through a stained glass window. Hamish didn't flinch. He merely opened one hazel eye to peer at the intruder. Nessie Curry, the village's notoriously gossipy postmistress, stood in the doorway, chest heaving, her woolen shawl slipping off her narrow shoulders. Her face, usually pinched, was entirely drained of colour. "Hamish," she gasped, clutching the doorframe. "It's murder. A terrible, terrible murder." Hamish sighed softly. A long, mournful sound. He looked at his steaming mug of coffee. It was just reaching the perfect temperature. "Now, Nessie," he said, his voice a slow, soothing drawl. "Are ye sure it's murder? Ye said the same thing last week, when Dr. Brodie ran over Mrs. Wellington's prize cabbage." "It's not a cabbage, ye great lummox," Nessie shrieked, her voice echoing off the station walls. "It's a man, down by the old stone bridge. He's dead, Hamish, dead as a doornail, and looking like a right fool, too." Hamish slowly swung his legs down, ignoring the sharp protest of the armchair springs. "Which man, Nessie?" "That rude English fellow. The one who yelled at everyone?" "Pendleton." Hamish mourned his ruined day. "Right then, come on, Lugs. Duty calls." He shoved his arms into his regulation jacket, deliberately leaving a button undone, and grabbed his peaked cap. He moved with an exaggerated sluggishness that made Nessie stamp her foot in frustration. The air outside was biting, the sun doing nothing to melt the heavy frost on the heather. Hamish drove his decrepit police Land Rover down the winding track toward the river Dub, Lugs hanging his head out the passenger window. He parked a good distance from the bridge, taking care not to disturb the ground, and ambled the rest of the way on foot. Nessie had not exaggerated. The old stone bridge arched gracefully over the fast-flowing, icy waters of the river, but the picturesque scene was entirely ruined by the sight beneath it. Arthur Pendleton was suspended upside down, dangling like a grotesque pendulum beneath the central arch. The heavy, brand-new tweed trousers he had been so proud of were caught securely on a rusted, jutting iron stanchion used for holding ancient netting. His expensive tweed jacket had fallen around his ears, and his face, what Hamish could see of it, was a dark, congested purple. But what made the scene distinctly humiliating was the fact that Pendleton was entirely missing his shoes and trousers from the knees down. His pale, hairy calves were exposed to the freezing Highland air, clad only in one garish, argyle sock. The other foot was completely bare, looking incredibly vulnerable and pathetic. "Well, well," Hamish murmured, scratching his chin and putting on his best vacant expression. "That's a pure shame, so it is. A man shouldn't go climbing under bridges if he doesn't know how to dress for it." He scrambled down the snowy bank with a clumsiness that was entirely feigned. His sharp hazel eyes were missing nothing. The frost on the riverbank was pristine, undisturbed except for a set of deep, sliding gouges right at the edge of the bridge, the marks of a heavy man being pushed or dragged against his will. Hamish peered closer at the dangling body, careful not to touch anything. Pendleton's thick fingers were badly bruised, the nails cracked and bleeding slightly, as if he had clung desperately to the rough stone edge before slipping over into the void. And then there was the puzzle of the missing sock and shoes. Why take a dead man's footwear? It felt deliberate, deeply humiliating. It was a mocking message from someone who hated him, which, given Pendleton's abrasive behavior over the last 3 days, unfortunately narrowed the immediate suspect pool down to roughly every single resident in the village of Lochdubh. Lugs sniffed at a patch of disturbed earth near the bridge's footing and let out a sharp sneeze. "Aye, lad," Hamish said softly, ensuring no one was close enough to hear his sudden drop in rustic affectation. Summonan tipped him over, and they made quite sure he looked absolutely ridiculous doing it. He looked up at the pristine, cloudless sky and sighed heavily. He would have to call headquarters now. He would have to report a bizarre murder. Worse, he would have to deal with Detective Chief Inspector Blair from Strathbane, a violently angry man whose incompetence was matched only by his volume. Hamish trudged back up the steep snowy bank, his lanky shoulders slumped in genuine misery. His peaceful life in Lochdubh was officially suspended. The peace of Lochdubh was not just shattered, it was effectively pulverized within the hour. The sound of high-performance police sirens, a screeching, wailing intrusion that no 1 inches the village ever wished to hear, ripped through the stillness of the valley. Following the lead vehicle, an aggressive red sedan, came 2 more police cars, kicking up gravel and slush as they skidded to a halt near the old stone bridge. Out of the lead car stepped DCI Blair. He was a man who seemed to be perpetually on the verge of a cardiac event, his face a mottled, angry plum color that clashed violently with his regulation uniform. Behind him trailed a handful of uniformed constables, who looked like they were terrified to breathe in his presence. "Macbeth," Blair roared, his voice carrying easily over the babbling of the river. He stomped toward the bridge, his polished shoes sliding dangerously on the icy patches of the road. "I knew it. I knew if I left you alone for 5 minutes, you'd find a way to make a total disaster out of this district. What in the name of all that is holy is happening here?" Hamish leaned against the hood of his Land Rover, having just finished his call to headquarters. He looked suitably sheepish, his cap pulled low over his eyes and his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Morning, Chief Inspector. It's a bit of a mess, as you can see. Some poor soul had an unfortunate tumble from the bridge." Blair marched up to him, stopping inches from Hamish's nose. He was a shorter man, but he made up for it with a sheer, unadulterated volume of spite. "An unfortunate tumble, you lazy, simple-minded cretin. Look at that man, dangling. Do people usually tumble into their own deaths while losing their shoes and trousers? This is a homicide investigation, and I am taking over immediately. You are sidelined. Do you hear me? I want you out of the way before you contaminate every shred of evidence with your incompetence." "Aye, sir," Hamish said, looking at his boots. "I'll just stay out of the way then, shall I?" "You'll do more than that," Blair barked, spinning around to face his team. "You will go to your little station You will sit on your hands, and you will wait for me to file a report that doesn't mention your name, because I don't want your dismal record dragging down the efficiency rating of this department." Blair turned his attention back to the hanging body, his face contorted in a sneer. He didn't bother to look at the ground. He didn't notice the precise set of footprints trailing away toward the wooded copse at the edge of the river. He didn't even notice the small, torn piece of blue silk caught on a nearby hawthorn bush. He simply surveyed the scene with the arrogance of a man who had already decided on the narrative. "Obviously," Blair proclaimed, loud enough for the gathering crowd of villagers to hear, "this is a robbery gone wrong. Professional job. See the way he's stripped." Clearly, they were looking for a wallet or a watch and panicked when he put up a struggle. Hamish, standing a respectful distance away, felt his brow crease. A robbery, the man's expensive gold ring, was still glinting on his finger. His gold watch was still strapped to his wrist, reflecting the winter sun. It was the most glaringly obvious thing in the world. Yet Blair was already scribbling into his notebook with furious energy. "Sir," Hamish ventured, his voice barely above a whisper. "The watch, sir. It's still there. And the ring." Blair whimpered, his eyes bulging. "Did I ask for your opinion, Macbeth? I have been in this force for 20 years. I think I know what a robbery looks like. Don't you try to tell me how to read a crime scene when you spend your days poaching salmon and sleeping in your office. Get out. Go." Hamish turned, his shoulders slumping as he walked back toward his vehicle. He caught the eye of Mr. Patel, who was watching from the bridge approach with a look of profound skepticism. Hamish gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "They'll be arresting that poor man who works at the local garage," Hamish whispered to Luggs as he climbed into the driver's seat. "Blair needs someone quick, someone he can bully, and someone who won't argue back." As he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror. Blair was already shouting at one of the village youths, a quiet boy named Davy who had been fixing a tractor near the bridge, dragging him over to the body and pointing a thick, accusatory finger. The investigation was off to a roaring, idiotic start. Hamish felt the familiar, dull ache of annoyance. If Blair arrested the wrong man, the village would be in an uproar. The truth would be buried under a mountain of bureaucratic ego, and Hamish would be forced to actually do some work. He hated doing work, especially when it involved cleaning up after a man as willfully blind as Blair. But as he put the Land Rover into gear, he noticed a splash of mud on the opposite bank, a distinct, heavy tread that didn't match any of the village's boots. Blair was too busy playing the hero to look at the ground. But Hamish already had a different theory forming. The theft wasn't about money. It was about humiliation, and whoever had left Arthur Pendleton hanging like a prize fish had wanted him to look as undignified as possible before he died. Hamish drove slowly, taking the long way back to the station. He wasn't going to report to the station as ordered. He had a few people to talk to, and he needed a very large pot of coffee to help him think. The useless peasant routine was about to get a lot more demanding. The sun began to dip behind the serrated peaks of the mountains, casting long, bruised purple shadows across Lochdubh. The village was quiet, but it was a brittle, anxious silence. Most of the residents were behind locked doors, peering through twitching curtains at the police vehicles still clustered near the bridge. DCI Blair was in his element, holding court on the roadside and terrifying anyone who happened to walk by with a pair of boots that looked even remotely sturdy. Hamish ignored the circus. He knew exactly where the real story was being told, and it certainly wasn't under the nose of a man who thought a gold watch on a dead body was a sign of a robbery. He pulled the Land Rover to a stop behind the local curry shop, a small, aromatic establishment that served as the true nerve center of the village. He smoothed his unruly red hair, adjusted his jumper, and stepped out into the biting evening air. Inside, the shop was a sanctuary of warmth, and the scent of cumin and turmeric. Hamish, the owner, Mr. Gupt, said, not looking up from his chopping. He was a small man with eyes that saw everything and a heart that was perpetually worried about his reputation. "The police have been here. They asked many questions about the Englishman. I told them nothing." "That's wise, Mr. Gup," Hamish said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Very wise. Could I trouble you for a cup of tea?" and maybe a small portion of that chicken curry. I've had a long day, and the hills have a way of making one's stomach quite insistent. Gup sighed, but began plating the food. He was a difficult man. This, Pendleton. He came here yesterday, sat in that very chair, and told me the spice was unhygienic. He demanded to see my health certificates. He threatened to have the shop closed down. Hamish took a bite of the curry, nodding slowly. He seems to have been making a list of enemies then. Did anyone else come in after him? Mrs. Wellington, Gup said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She came in for her takeaway about an hour after him. She was furious. He had told her that her prize-winning spaniels were nothing but glorified, noisy rats. She said to me, "Gupt, that man will be sorry he ever came to this valley." She was very red in the face. Hamish chewed thoughtfully. Mrs. Wellington was a pillar of the community, usually more interested in flower arranging than murder, but the Highland temper was a deep, slow-burning thing. Did she seem like she meant it, or was she just venting? In this village, Hamish, there is little difference, Gupt replied, sliding a cup of tea across the counter. But he also spoke to the Reverend. They were at the hotel lounge. I saw them through the window while I was closing up. Pendleton was laughing at him, pointing at his collar and shaking his head. The Reverend did not look like a man of God at that moment. He looked like a man who wanted to strike someone. Hamish finished his meal, thanked Gupt, and wandered back out into the night. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but they didn't paint a picture of a robbery. They painted a picture of a man who had treated the entire village as his personal punching bag. He moved toward the post office, where he knew Nessie would be sorting the late mail. She was the best source of information, mostly because she read everything that didn't have a seal. He found her sitting behind the counter, peering through a magnifying glass at a postcard. "Nessie," Hamish said, leaning on the counter with a look of extreme, simple-minded boredom. "I'm fairly exhausted. Blair's got me running around like a headless chicken. He thinks it's a robbery, though, so he's got me looking for people who were acting suspicious near the shops." Nessie snorted, her eyes wide with indignation. "A robbery, that fool. I saw him talking to the local banker, telling him it was all about money. It was no robbery, Hamish. The man was a parasite. He was poking his nose into everyone's business. He told the schoolteacher that her curriculum was substandard, and he told the baker that his flour was inferior." "Did he receive any mail then?" Hamish asked, picking up a pen and twiddling it. "Anything unusual?" "Threats, maybe," Nessie hesitated, then lowered her voice. "He received a package yesterday, thick, heavy. It came from a solicitor in London. I didn't open it, of course. Well, not much. But the return address was a firm that handles inheritance disputes. He seemed very pleased with it. He spent half the morning telling anyone who would listen that he was about to become the rightful owner of the property bordering his, which happens to be the communal pasture the village has used for decades." Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the night air. The communal pasture. If Pendleton had found some obscure legal loophole to seize that land, he would have effectively crippled the village's ability to keep their livestock. It wasn't just about rudeness anymore. It was an existential threat. "Thanks, Nessie," Hamish said, his voice dropping to his natural thoughtful register for a split second before reverting to his lazy tone. "Keep your ears open. Blair's a loud man, and he's bound to miss the quiet bits." As he stepped out into the freezing night, Hamish realized the motive was far deeper than simple irritation. It was the survival of the village itself. Pendleton wasn't just a rude neighbor, he was an invader. And in Lochdubh, when you threatened the land, you didn't just invite a lawsuit. You invited a disaster. He walked back to his Land Rover, the stars wheeling coldly overhead. He had enough now to know that Blair's robbery theory was complete nonsense. But he still had to figure out who had actually tied the knots, and more importantly, why they had been so careful to humiliate him first. He needed to see the Reverend and Mrs. Wellington, but he'd have to do it carefully. If they were involved, they would be terrified, and terror made people do very dangerous things. For now, he needed sleep, a hot stove, and a very quiet plan. The next morning broke with a sky, the color of a bruised plum, the heavy, wet snow clinging to the window panes of the police station, like damp wool. Hamish stood at his small stove, staring at a pot of bubbling porridge, while Lugs watched him with unblinking, soulful eyes. The murder of Arthur Pendleton was still an open wound, and the village was currently under siege by DCI Blair's ego. A sharp, rhythmic rapping at the door cut through the quiet. Hamish wiped his hands on his trousers and opened the door to find Priscilla Halberton, Smythe standing there. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored, waterproof hacking jacket, her dark hair tucked perfectly into a silk scarf. She looked entirely out of place in the cramped, smoky environment of the police station, like a rare exotic bird that had mistakenly landed in a barn. "Hamish," she said, her voice crisp and cool. "The entire village is in a state of absolute terror. Blair is interrogating the local postman, as if he's a hardened, criminal mastermind. It's utterly embarrassing, well," Hamish said. Moving back to his stove to stir the porridge, "Blair's not a man for nuance, is he? Would ye like a coffee, Priscilla? It's not the fancy kind you drink at the manor, but it's hot." Priscilla sighed, stepping inside and shaking the snow from her boots. She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the piles of old reports and the single, sagging armchair. "You look exhausted, Hamish. Have you been up all night?" "Thinking," he replied, handing her a mug. "Pendleton wasn't just murdered, he was made a spectacle. There's a message in that, and I'm trying to read it. He was planning to take the communal pasture. Did you know that?" Priscilla went still, the steam from her mug curling around her face. "The communal pasture, that's ancient land. It belongs to the crown. But the village has grazing rights dating back centuries. That's absurd. Even the most arrogant Sassenach wouldn't think they could seize that." "He had a letter," Hamish explained, seated at a small wooden table, "from a London law firm. He was gloating about it. Someone new. Maybe someone who stood to lose the most if that pasture disappeared." Priscilla set her mug down with a sharp clack. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You're thinking of the village elders, then? The Reverend Mrs. Wellington." "I'm thinking," Hamish corrected gently, "that everyone had a motive, but not everyone has the physical strength to drag a man like Pendleton to that bridge and string him up like a carcass. It took planning, strength, and a cold, hard lack of mercy." Priscilla sighed, her posture softening. She looked at Hamish, really looked at him, and for a moment, the distance between their two worlds vanished. "Hamish, you're far too clever for this position. Why do you insist on acting like a village simpleton? You know Blair is going to pin this on the first person he can intimidate. If you don't intervene, he's going to destroy a life." "If I intervene," Hamish said, a trace of his natural, sharp-edged intelligence surfacing, "I'll look too competent. If I look too competent, they'll promote me. They'll send me to Glasgow, or worse, London. I like my life here, Priscilla. I like the wind, the mountains, and the quiet. I don't want a promotion." Priscilla laughed, a short, musical sound that seemed to brighten the dim room. "You are an impossible man. You would rather let an innocent person be bullied by that buffoon than risk a promotion. You care more about your peace than the truth." "I care about both," Hamish replied, his voice dropping. "But the truth has a way of coming out if you listen carefully enough. I need to know why he was stripped, Priscilla. Why take the shoes and the trousers? It wasn't just humiliation. It was a ritual." Priscilla frowned, thinking. "A ritual? Well, you know the old local folklore, don't you? About the debt of the bridge. It's a silly old superstition. The legend says that anyone who tries to take what belongs to the village must be stripped of their status, their clothes, their shoes, their pride, before they can be returned to the river. It's a symbolic cleansing." Hamish sat back, his heart thumping slowly. "The debt of the bridge. I haven't heard that since I was a lad." "It's just nonsense," she said, dismissively. "But perhaps that's what the killer was thinking. They weren't just killing a man, they were carrying out a justice that dates back centuries. Or," Hamish mused, "someone wants us to believe that. Someone who knows the village's history well enough to use it as a cover." "Be careful, Hamish," Priscilla said, standing up and brushing stray hair from her forehead. You're playing a very dangerous game, and Blair is not a man who appreciates being made to look like a fool. If you find the killer, make sure you don't do it in a way that puts a spotlight on yourself. She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the latch. I'll keep an ear to the ground at the manor. My father's solicitors might know something about that London firm. They deal with the same circles. If Pendleton was making legal moves, there would be a record. Thank you, Priscilla, Hamish said, watching her go. As the door closed, he felt a familiar, quiet tension. She was right. He was playing a dangerous game. But as he looked at the cold, grey sky outside, he felt the first true spark of purpose. He wasn't just a lazy policeman anymore. He was the guardian of the village, and he was going to find out who had turned an ancient superstition into a murder weapon. He picked up his coat, ready to face the freezing wind. It was time to stop being lazy and start being very, very observant. By late afternoon, the atmosphere in Lochdubh had soured into something truly bitter. The wind had picked up, howling down from the mountains and whistling through the cracks in the old stone walls, carrying with it a fine, stinging sleet. DCI Blair was in a state of unmitigated triumph. He had cornered Davy, the young, quiet tractor mechanic, in the back room of the village hotel. The poor boy was currently sitting on a wooden chair, surrounded by 3 of Blair's hulking constables, weeping softly as he tried to explain that he had merely been working on a broken gear linkage at the time of the murder. Hamish watched from the shadows of the hotel hallway, his hands deep in his pockets. He was nursing a cold coffee, his posture carefully constructed to suggest a man who was merely waiting for a taxi, not someone who was meticulously dismantling a murder investigation in his head. I tell you, he's the one. Blair's voice boomed from the room, loud enough to rattle the glassware on the bar. Look at him. He's sweating. He knows exactly what happened to those trousers. He's the only one who knows the layout of that bridge because he's always out there messing with his tractors. It's an open and shut case of a local boy losing his temper and trying to cover his tracks with some kind of folk nonsense. Hamish shook his head slowly. The evidence against Davy was entirely circumstantial, born of the boy's shyness and his proximity to the scene. It was the sort of easy, lazy conclusion that Blair adored. It required no real investigative work, just a bit of bullying and a convenient scapegoat. He slipped quietly out of the hotel and made his way toward the local garage, his mind turning over the details. He had spent the last hour observing the scene from a distance, not focusing on the body, but on the surroundings. Something had been nagging at him, a tiny overlooked detail that had nothing to do with folk superstitions or rural grudges. He reached the garage, where Davy's tools were laid out in an orderly fashion on a workbench. He walked to the corner where the boy kept his spares. There, lying on a rag, was a set of heavy-duty pliers, caked in dried, reddish clay. It was the same clay found on the riverbank near the bridge. Hamish picked them up. They were heavy, strong, and perfectly capable of pulling a knot tight enough to hold a man's weight against a rusted iron stanchion. But as he examined them, he noticed something else. A small, vibrant blue thread was caught in the hinge of the pliers, the same color as the silk thread he had seen snagged on the hawthorn bush at the crime scene. A sudden, sharp realization hit him. The killer hadn't used tools that belonged to a mechanic. They had used someone else's, and they had been careless enough to leave a trace. He looked at the floor near the workbench. There was a faint, almost invisible scuff mark, the mark of a fine-soled Italian shoe, not a heavy-duty work boot. The pieces began to lock together. The killer wasn't Davy. The killer was someone who had walked into this garage to stage a frame-up, someone who had stolen the tools to make it look like a crime of opportunity by a local, but had been too arrogant to realize that the evidence didn't match the perpetrator. He heard a floorboard creak in the darkness behind him. Hamish spun around, his lazy demeanor vanishing in an instant, his posture shifting to a state of coiled predator-like tension. Standing in the doorway was the village minister, his face pale and his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperation. In his hand, he clutched a heavy iron wrench. "Hamish," the minister whispered, his voice shaking. I was just looking for Davy. I heard he was in trouble. Hamish didn't move. He looked at the minister's feet. They were encased in expensive, polished loafers. The very same type of fine-soled shoe that would leave a scuff mark on the concrete floor of the garage. "You didn't come to check on Davy, Minister," Hamish said, his voice hard and cold. "You came to plant evidence? You realized the tools were too clean, didn't you? You wanted to make sure they looked like they'd been used for the murder." The minister's grip on the wrench tightened, his knuckles white. "He was going to ruin us, Hamish. That pasture was the lifeblood of this village. He threatened to turn our history into a parking lot for his retreat. He didn't deserve to breathe our air. So you decided to play the judge and jury?" Hamish asked, his voice steady. "And you decided to use an old superstition to hide your work. You thought, if you made him look like he was being punished by the bridge, no one would look for a real killer. It was justice," the minister shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "It was the only way to save Lochdubh." Hamish stood his ground, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him. He knew he had him, but he also knew that if he arrested him now, Blair would take the credit, and the truth, the full, ugly, complicated truth, would be buried by the police department's need for a quick conviction. He had to lead the minister into a position where he would expose himself before the entire village. "You made a mistake, Minister," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr. "You forgot that in a village like this, people don't just look at the evidence. They listen to what people don't say. And everyone knows you were terrified of that land sale. You were the only one who didn't come to the town meeting to discuss the legal protest. You were already planning your own solution." The minister's eyes flickered, his confidence faltering. He looked at the door, then back at Hamish. The trap was closing, but Hamish wasn't done yet. He needed the village to see the man behind the cloth, and he needed Blair to realize he had been chasing the wrong shadow the entire time. He had the proof, he had the motive, and now he had the killer standing exactly where he wanted him. The air in the small garage felt suddenly devoid of oxygen, heavy with the scent of motor oil and the sour tang of the minister's mounting panic. Hamish stood like a pillar of granite, his lanky frame occupying the narrow gap between the workbench and the door. His eyes locked onto the minister. The man was trembling, the heavy wrench in his hand swaying with the tremors of his arm. "You think you're so clever, don't you, Hamish?" the minister hissed, his usual calm pulpit, ready voice replaced by a jagged, uneven rasp. "You think you can just sit there, nursing your grievances and your coffee, while the rest of us actually care about the survival of this community?" Pendleton wasn't just a man, he was a cancer. He had the legal papers. He had the influence to bypass every local objection. If we didn't stop him, there would be no Lochdubh left for anyone. It would have been a boutique resort for the wealthy, and we would have been the house servants. Hamish didn't blink. He kept his posture intentionally slouched, his head tilted in that familiar, vacant way that had always lulled people into underestimating him. "It's a long way from the pulpit to a murder. Minister, seems like a heavy price to pay for a field." "It isn't just a field," the minister shouted, stepping forward. The wrench hit the concrete with a dull, ringing thud as he dropped it, his face crumbling into a mask of wretchedness. "My grandfather is buried in the plot that shares the boundary of that pasture. If he had turned it into a parking area, they would have dug up the graves. They would have paved over everything that mattered here. He wouldn't listen. He laughed at me when I begged him to reconsider. He told me he'd put a swimming pool over the headstones just to see the look on my face." Hamish felt a flicker of grim understanding. The motive wasn't just about the village. It was deeply, violently personal. It was a classic Highland grudge, the kind that festered for generations and boiled over the moment a line was crossed. The humiliation of the body, the stripping of the clothes, the exposure to the elements, was a symbolic stripping of Pendleton's modern, cold-blooded authority, forcing him to be vulnerable in the very land he had threatened to desecrate. "So you decided to make him a sacrifice," Hamish said softly. "You used the old stories because you thought the village would understand. You thought they'd look at the body and think, the old spirits have come to take what is ours back. I thought they would welcome it. the minister whispered, sinking onto a stack of tires, his hands covering his face. I thought when they saw him there, stripped of his arrogance, they would feel relieved. I didn't mean for it to become this circus with Blair. Well, you failed there, Hamish said, his voice hardening. You brought the circus to our door. You've got the entire police force of Strathbane breathing down the necks of innocent people. You haven't saved the village, you've turned it into a target. Everyone is terrified, everyone is being harassed, and the truth is being smothered by a man who couldn't find a clue if it was sitting on his dinner plate. The minister looked up, his eyes glassy with tears. What do you want, Hamish? Are you going to take me to them? Are you going to let that brute Blair drag me away? I'm going to do my job, Hamish said, but not the way Blair wants. He realized then that the hidden motive wasn't just the pasture or the graves. It was the total absence of a moral compass in the face of perceived existential threats. The minister had allowed his own desperation to override everything he preached. He had become the very thing he claimed to despise, a cold, calculating arbiter of life and death, hiding behind the mask of local tradition. You're going to tell me exactly how you did it, Hamish continued, his voice devoid of sympathy. You're going to tell me how you got him to the bridge, who you had helping you. Because one man couldn't have managed that lift, and you're going to help me end this before someone else gets destroyed by Blair's incompetence. The minister stared at him, seeing for the first time the sharp, penetrating intelligence behind the lazy facade. He saw a man who wasn't just a local constable, but a protector who played by rules the outsider couldn't possibly understand. I didn't act alone, the minister confessed, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Wellington. She was the one who provided the rope. She was the one who kept watch. She wanted it done as much as I did. Hamish nodded slowly. He should have known. Mrs. Wellington's fury had been too precise, too well channeled. The village had conspired in its own way to protect its legacy. A silent, deadly agreement that had crossed the line into homicide. Get up, Hamish commanded. We're going to finish this, but we're going to do it my way, and pray that when this is over, the village still has something left to call a soul. He stepped aside to let the broken man pass, his mind already calculating the next step. The trap was almost set. He just had to make sure the right people were watching when the truth finally broke the surface. He felt no triumph, only a heavy, familiar weariness. The quiet life he loved was fragile, and it had been broken by the very people who claimed to love it the most. He followed the minister out into the cold, driving rain, the silence of the night, now heavy with the weight of impending justice. The following morning was a study in misery, a thick, wet that peculiar Highland fog, that tastes of brine and impending sorrow had rolled in from the sea, swallowing the village in a claustrophobic grey shroud. It was the perfect atmosphere for a funeral or a final reckoning. Hamish had spent the night in a fever of careful preparation. He had spoken to Mrs. Wellington in the quiet of her parlour, her hands shaking as she arranged her flowers, the guilt etched into the very lines of her face. She hadn't denied her involvement. She had simply wept for the village, convinced that her actions were a necessary sacrifice for the preservation of Lochdubh. Hamish hadn't offered comfort, nor had he offered judgment. He had simply given them their instructions. DCI Blair was currently in the village hotel, red-faced and bellowing at his subordinates, frustrated that his open and shut case against the young mechanic was hitting legal roadblocks. The prosecutor in Strathbane had balked at the lack of forensic evidence, and Blair was now desperate for a public confession to save his reputation. I want them all in the village square, Blair had roared earlier that morning. I'll break them. I'll show them what happens when they mess with the police. That was exactly what Hamish had been waiting for. He found Blair outside the hotel, standing by his red sedan, his coat buttoned tightly against the biting damp. Chief Inspector, Hamish said, adopting his most vacant, shuffling posture, I think I've found something. Down at the bridge. Some evidence that might clear young Davy and point to the real troublemaker. Blair spun around, his eyes narrow and suspicious. Oh, have you now, Macbeth? And why haven't you brought it to me sooner, you lazy, incompetent fool? It's a bit complicated, sir, Hamish muttered, looking down at his boots. "It's about tradition. The debt of the bridge. I found the person who was talking about it. They're planning to meet there again today, I think, to finish the ceremony." Blair's ears perked up, his ego blinding him to the obvious absurdity of the suggestion. He wanted a dramatic resolution, a headline-grabbing arrest that would validate his theory of a local cult. "Who?" Blair barked. "Who is planning this?" "I can't say for sure, sir," Hamish lied, his voice trembling with a well-rehearsed, feigned uncertainty. "But I saw someone near the bridge last night. They left a mark. If you go down there now, you might catch them red-handed." Blair didn't need further convincing. He turned to his men, shouting orders with the fervor of a general embarking on a crusade. Within minutes, the police convoy was rumbling through the fog toward the River Dubh. Hamish followed at a distance, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. He had set the stage. He had made sure that the minister and Mrs. Wellington knew to be there, not because they were going to continue their ceremony, but because they were prepared to finally confess to the man who would listen and to the man who would be forced to document it. He had orchestrated a final public disclosure. He had instructed the minister to hold the confession in the presence of the entire village, making it impossible for Blair to hide the truth or pin it on an innocent party. By the time the police arrived, the village would already be there, witnessing the end of the secret. As the cars pulled up to the bridge, the fog seemed to swirl and part, revealing the minister standing on the central arch, his dark coat flapping in the damp breeze. Beside him stood Mrs. Wellington, her head held high, her eyes fixed on the cold, rushing water below. A crowd of villagers had gathered on the banks, their faces solemn and still. They weren't there to support a crime. They were there to witness the end of a nightmare. Blair slammed his car door, his face alight with a dark, triumphant glee. "Aha! I knew it. A public gathering. A confession in the making." He began to scramble up the bank, his men fanning out behind him. Hamish stayed behind, leaning against the cold stone of the bridge's footing. He watched as Blair approached the two figures on the arch. The minister turned, his expression serene, his hands empty. He didn't look like a killer anymore. He looked like a man who had finally shed a weight he could no longer carry. "Datesy Blair," the minister said, his voice carrying clearly through the damp air. "We have something to tell you, something that has been tearing the heart out of this village." Blair stopped, his mouth hanging open. He wasn't expecting a calm confession. He was expecting a chase, a fight, a drama he could control. He looked around at the silent, watching villagers, feeling for the first time the weight of their judgment. "You're under arrest," Blair shouted, though the confidence had bled out of his tone. "We know," Mrs. Wellington replied, her voice soft and steady. Hamish watched from the shadows of the bank, his work almost complete. He had forced the truth into the light, and he had made sure there was no way for Blair to distort it. He had played the fool, the lazy policeman, the simple-minded local, and in doing so, he had become the most dangerous man in the room. He felt the cold damp of the fog on his face, but for the first time in days, he felt a measure of peace. The storm was breaking, and soon the village would be quiet once more. He just had to ensure that when the dust settled, he would be left alone in the aftermath. The confrontation began not with a bang, but with a horrifying, strangled gasp from DCI Blair. He stood on the damp, uneven stones of the bridge, his face shifting from an expression of predatory triumph to one of utter, bewildered outrage. The villagers did not move, but the air around them seemed to thicken with a collective, silent disapproval that stopped Blair in his tracks. "Confession," Blair barked, his voice cracking. "What are you talking about? I don't want a lecture. I want to know who killed Pendleton. I want to know who destroyed the scene and tried to make a mockery of my investigation." The minister looked at Blair, then toward the river below, and finally at the gathered faces of his parishioners. When he spoke, his voice was hollowed out by grief, purged of the hysteria that had gripped him in the garage. "We did, Inspector. We acted as the hand of this village. We decided that Arthur Pendleton had no place here, and we ensured he would never threaten our home again." Mrs. Wellington stepped forward, her posture rigid. "He was a parasite, Inspector. He would have torn the soul out of Lochdubh for the sake of a few pounds, and a bit of vanity. We saved this place from him. Blair's face turned an alarming, mottled purple. He whipped his head around, searching for Hamish. But Hamish had stepped further into the grey curtain of the fog, becoming nearly invisible against the mist-covered heather. "Macbeth, where are you? You? You were supposed to be investigating a cult. You were supposed to be finding evidence of a criminal syndicate. What is this nonsense?" "There is no syndicate, sir," the minister said, his voice rising, carrying over the roar of the river. "There is only a village that was pushed to its breaking point. We didn't want a murder. We wanted peace. But you, with your loud cars and your angry shouting, you've turned our private tragedy into a public circus. You've treated us like common criminals, and in doing so, you've forced us to reveal the truth." Blair lunged forward, his hands reaching for the minister's collar, his rage finally overcoming his professional restraint. "You're all mad. You're all involved in a conspiracy. I'll arrest a lot of you. I'll charge the whole village with obstructing justice." As Blair's heavy hand gripped the minister's coat, the scene erupted into a chaotic surge of movement. The villagers, usually so quiet and detached, surged forward in a protective wall. It wasn't a riot, but it was a firm, undeniable statement of solidarity. The tension, held in check for days, shattered. Hamish knew this was the moment. He stepped out from the fog, his movements fast, sure, and entirely lacking in the lethargy he usually wore like a second skin. He grabbed Blair's arm, pulling him back from the minister with a force that surprised even the hardened inspector. "Leave off, sir," Hamish snapped, his voice dropping into that rare resonant register that commanded instant attention. "The law is for justice, not for your temper. They've confessed. You have your culprits. Arrest them if you must, but don't you dare lay a finger on anyone else in this valley." Blair whirled around, eyes bulging. You were holding out on me. You knew." "I knew they were hurting," Hamish said, his hazel eyes locking onto Blair's with an intensity that made the inspector recoil. "And I knew you'd never find the truth because you didn't care about the village. You only cared about your career." The minister struggled to maintain his footing, his knees buckling under the weight of the moment. He reached out to grab the railing of the bridge to steady himself. And in a sudden, frantic twist of fate, the rusted metal already compromised by the very act of the murder gave a sharp, sickening groan. Pendleton's body, still wedged awkwardly below, shifted. The sudden movement sent a tremor through the structure. The minister lost his balance, tumbling toward the edge. Hamish didn't hesitate. He dived, his body arching over the railing, his fingers locking onto the minister's coat just as he slipped past the stone wall. The momentum was violent. Hamish slammed against the wet stone, the wind knocked out of him, but he held on with a desperate, crushing strength. "Lugs, now," Hamish shouted, and the mongrel dog, who had been sitting perfectly still, suddenly lunged forward, barking a sharp, commanding alarm that cut through the noise of the river. The villagers rushed to assist. Hands reached out, grabbing the minister's arms, pulling him back from the icy drop. It was a messy, frantic struggle, but they pulled him to safety. Blair stood, frozen, his face a mask of shock. He had seen the lazy policeman move with the speed of a striking viper, and he had seen the village unite in a way that he couldn't possibly understand or contain. The power dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the man in charge. He was merely an intruder in a world that didn't want him. Hamish lay on the cold stone, panting, his knuckles white from the grip on the minister's coat. The fog seemed to press in closer, turning the scene into a tableau of grey and silver. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the river. The confession had been made, the culprit was saved from the water, and the truth, the ugly, sorrowful truth, was now exposed for everyone to see. Blair's victory, if it could even be called that, tasted like ash. He had his arrests, but he had lost his authority, and he knew it. The villagers had spoken, and they had chosen their own defender. The aftermath of the confession at the bridge was a curious study in human nature. With the minister and Mrs. Wellington in custody, sitting stoically in the back of a police van, the village of Lochdubh retreated into a shell of protective silence. The rage that had driven the crime seemed to evaporate, replaced by a somber, collective acceptance of the consequences. For DCI Blair, however, the mood was entirely different. He was preening, pacing the length of the bridge with his chest puffed out, convinced that his hard-nosed interrogation techniques had finally forced the guilty parties to crack. Hamish stood apart from the activity, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat, watching the scene with a detached, sleepy expression. He had wiped the adrenaline from his face, returning to his mask of lanky, unbothered incompetence. He knew that if he played this correctly, the entire ordeal would be filed away as a textbook example of Blair's superior police work, and his own name would be relegated to the bottom of the paperwork. "Macbeth!" Blair shouted, gesturing grandly toward the van. "Get over here and finish up the logs. I want a full statement from every witness, and I want it done before we leave. This case has been a logistical nightmare, but my intervention has successfully brought the culprits to justice. It will look very good in the final report to the chief constable." Hamish sauntered over, dragging his feet slightly. "Aye, sir. Very impressive. I don't think I would have ever gotten them to talk like that. You have a real way with them, sir. It's almost like you knew it was them all along." Blair beamed, his mottled face turning a shade of satisfied crimson. He was far too enamored with the sound of his own voice to question the sarcasm that lay hidden beneath the soft Scottish lilt. "Of course I knew. It was obvious from the beginning. A robbery was the cover, but I saw through their little charade. It's a shame this district is so plagued by petty, backward-thinking superstitions. But at least there's a capable officer here to clean up the mess." "Oh, absolutely, sir," Hamish replied, his voice dripping with sycophantic praise. "I'll make sure to note in the report that it was your direct intervention that secured the confessions. I wouldn't want anyone to think I had anything to do with it. I'm just happy to be out of the way, to be honest. It's a lot of paperwork, and it keeps me from my dinner." Blair slapped Hamish on the shoulder, a heavy, patronizing gesture. "Don't you worry, Macbeth. I'll make sure the chief constable knows who was responsible for the tactical breakthrough, and I'll be sure to highlight your limited contribution to the logistics." Hamish nodded, bowing his head slightly as if embarrassed. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. I'm really not suited for the big cases, you know. I prefer the sheep and the lost tourists. A man of my talents needs simple tasks." As Blair bustled off to instruct his team, Hamish felt a wave of relief, so intense it nearly made him dizzy. He had done it. He had ensured that the credit and the inevitable, unwanted attention that came with it would go to the man who craved it most. He had effectively blocked any path toward a promotion or a transfer. The files would show that he had been sidelined, that he had been essentially useless, and that the brilliant DCI Blair had swooped in to save the day. He was safe. He was going to stay in Lochdubh in his drafty little station, in his beloved, quiet life. The villagers watched the police cars begin to pull away, their expressions unreadable. There was no joy in the departure, only a quiet, resolute sadness for the loss of their minister and their friend. Mrs. Wellington was driven away in silence, her head held high. As the last vehicle disappeared around the bend, the village settled back into its own rhythm. The fog began to lift, revealing the stark, beautiful silhouette of the mountains against the darkening sky. Hamish walked back toward the village, Lugs trotting faithfully at his side. He passed the general store, where Mr. Patel stood in the doorway, watching the horizon. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The justice that had been served was neither clean nor perfect, but it was the only kind the village had left. The threat of the pasture being sold was gone, but the cost had been the destruction of the very people who had fought for it. He reached his small stone station and pushed open the door. The familiar scent of wood smoke and old paper greeted him like an old friend. He walked to his stove, threw on a fresh log, and began to boil the water for his tea. He felt a deep, profound tiredness in his bones, but for the first time in days, his mind was still. He had kept his secret, he had kept his home, and the world had moved on. None the wiser about the man who lived behind the badge. He sat in his chair, poured his tea, and watched the fire crackle. The mystery was over, the police were gone, and the village of Lochdubh was, for better or for worse, still his own. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind outside, and allowed himself the luxury of a long, undisturbed evening. The lazy policeman was back, and he was quite content to stay that way for a very long time. The morning after the police convoy finally cleared out of Lochdubh, the village felt like a ship that had narrowly survived a storm. The air was unnaturally still. The frost-laden silence returned to the hills, and the only reminder of the previous week's chaos was the lingering smell of exhaust fumes near the bridge. Hamish Macbeth stood on his doorstep, nursing a mug of coffee that was finally, mercifully, not being interrupted by the frantic demands of a superior officer. He took a slow, steaming sip, his eyes tracking a golden eagle circling high above the crags. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the only thing on his agenda was the prospect of checking his snares and perhaps catching up on a nap. He had spent the previous evening cleaning his station, burning the notes he'd taken. That didn't pertain to the official, Blair-approved version of events. There was no trace left of his real investigation, no evidence of the sharp-eyed policeman who had orchestrated a confession from the shadows. A shadow fell across his doorstep. Hamish didn't look up, knowing the gate. It was Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She stood there, wrapped in a thick wool coat, looking at the village with a contemplative expression. "The police are gone, then," she said, her voice quiet. "Blair left behind a legacy of paperwork and, according to the gossip at the post office, a very inflated sense of his own brilliance." Hamish said, leaning against the doorframe. "He's happy. The village is quiet. It's what we wanted, I suppose." "Is it?" Priscilla asked, turning to face him. "The minister and Mrs. Wellington will be in custody for a long time, Hamish. The village has lost 2 of its pillars. That's a heavy price for a pasture, no matter how ancient it is." Hamish looked at his mug. "They made their choice, Priscilla. They thought they were protecting something, but they got lost in doing it. You can't save a place by destroying the very humanity that makes it a home. It's a sad thing, truly." Priscilla sighed, a plume of breath misting in the cold air. "You saved the minister, you know, even after you knew what he'd done. Blair would have let him fall, or worse, would have enjoyed the spectacle." "I'm a policeman," Hamish said, his tone flat and devoid of heroics. "It's my job to prevent the loss of life, even the life of a man who's lost his own compass. Besides, I couldn't have the paperwork. A death at the bridge would have meant a full inquiry, and I really do hate inquiries." Priscilla smiled, a genuine, warm expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. She knew him better than he liked to admit. "You are an infuriating man, Hamish Macbeth. You spend your life hiding behind a mask of laziness. Yet, you're the most vigilant person in this entire valley. Do you never get tired of it? Don't you ever want to be seen for who you really are?" "And who is that?" Hamish asked, looking at her with a fleeting, intense seriousness. "A man who likes a quiet life, a decent cup of coffee, and the sight of the mountains in the morning. I've seen enough, thanks. Being seen is what leads to promotions, transfers, and the sort of life that involves wearing a tie to work. I'll take the obscurity if you don't mind." Priscilla laughed, shaking her head. "Well, you certainly have your way. The village seems to have collectively decided that the whole affair was just another stranger's folly. They're already talking about the next harvest. The tragedy is being folded into the history of the place, just like the old legends. That's the beauty of Lochdubh," Hamish said. "It has a way of absorbing everything and staying exactly the same. We survive." She lingered for a moment longer, then turned and began walking back toward the manor. Hamish watched her go, then retreated inside his station, locking the door with a sense of finality. He moved to his desk and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. The one he truly used. He wrote a single, final entry for the Pendleton case. Case closed. Village status returned to normalcy. Hamish status still in Lochdubh. He tossed the notebook into the drawer and walked over to his stove. He had a pot of hearty beef stew simmering, his own recipe, rich with root vegetables and plenty of herbs, and the aroma filling the room was the smell of contentment. Lugs, who had been dozing by the hearth, woke up and stretched, letting out a long, contented groan. Hamish sat in his armchair, the one with the sagging springs that he wouldn't trade for a throne. He picked up a book of old Highland folklore, but he didn't read. He simply sat, listening to the fire crackle and the distant sound of the wind moving over the heather. The murder had been a dark, ugly intrusion, a test of the village's character that had left deep, permanent scars. But as he looked around his quiet, smoky little room, Hamish felt a deep, quiet gratitude. He had fought his battle, he had protected his peace, and he had remained exactly where he wanted to be. He was Hamish Macbeth, the laziest, most observant man in the Highlands. And he was home. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the stove seeping into his bones, and let the quiet of Lochdubh settle over him like a heavy, comforting blanket. There was no more mystery, no more shouting, and no more detectives from the city. There was only the fire, the dog at his feet, and the long, glorious prospect of a day with absolutely nothing to do. It was, he decided, the perfect life.